Really appreciating you to be here to enhance the knowledge of our students. Um, okay, now handing over to Anish to do further procedure of this activity.
Thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful words. Moving further, I would like to inform you all that our our current chair of IEEE student branch is Engineer Poonam Sharma, who is also a faculty member in the Department of Electrical Engineering at Central University of Haryana. Under her leadership, we continue to grow and make significant contributions to the field of technology and its applications. Next, I would like to inform you all about IEEE IAS and Senior Council Student Branch Chapter of Central University of Haryana. It is a vital part of our university's IEEE student branch. Our chapter is dedicated to fostering technical knowledge and skills in the area of industrial applications and senior sensor technologies. We aim to provide students with opportunities for professional development, networking, and hands-on projects, enhancing their understanding and competence in their specialized fields of electrical and electronics engineering. Our current chair, Aditya Kumar, is a tech enthusiast who has been leading this chapter for the past 2 years. Under his leadership, our chapter has grown significantly, offering numerous opportunities for students to engage in innovative projects and gain valuable experience. Our vice chair, Azam Khan, plays a crucial role in supporting the chapter's activities and initiatives. It is my pleasure to now hand over the stage to Azam Khan for his introduction. Over to you, Azam.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm audible. Please let me confirm. I honor to welcome you to all to today's event. It is my pleasure to have with us today the renowned Professor Elisa Barney Smith from the Luleå University of Technology in Sweden. Professor Barney Smith will be exploring the fascinating world of digital humanities in the field of electrical engineering and computer science, and reveling in the mysteries of how these disciplines intersect. Thank you for joining us today. Now I would like to hand over the our session anchor, Mr. Anish.
Thank you, Azam. Let's now get to the introduction of our distinguished speaker today, Professor Alicia Barney Smith. Professor Barney Smith is a professor at Luleå Universities of Technologies in Sweden. She holds an endowed chair in the Wallenberg AI Autonomous Systems and Software Program within the LTU's Department of Computer Science, Electrical and Space Engineering, Internet Systems Lab, EIS Lab. Before joining LTU, she spent 22 years at Boise State Universities in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department. Professor Barney Smith earned her Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, Master of Science, and PhD degrees in Electrical, Computer, and Systems Engineering, all from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in York, New York, USA. Her primary research interests lie in image processing and machine learning. She applies these techniques to various fields, including document imaging, biomedical image processing, material science research, and soil remediation evaluation. Notably, her work in document analysis includes developing models of degradation during document imaging acquisition, pilot image processing, handwritten index script recognition. Professor Barney Smith has been part of numerous cross-disciplinary, multi-institutional, national, and international project teams. Her expertise has earned her invitations as a paid guest scientist at prestigious institutions, including the NATO Second Center in Italy, the ICLO National Superior de Telecommunication in Paris, France, Loria in Nancy, France, and Technical University Dortmund in Germany. She has co-authored a textbook on machine learning. Her work has been received funding from NSF, NASA, and various institutions, including the prestigious NSF Career Award. Professor Barney Smith is a member of the International Association of Pattern Recognition (IAPR) and a senior member of IEEE and SPIE. She has served as the chair of IEEE Bose Section, IEEE Region 6's Northeast Area Chair, and 2019 and 2020 IEEE Global Student Activities Committee Assessing Chair. We are honored to have such an accomplished and versatile researcher and educator with us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eliza Smith. Over to you, ma'am. Now the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Share my screen. And hang on. Share screen. There we go. Thank you very much for inviting me. You get this thing going. Is my screen visible to all of you?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me. I very much enjoy sharing what I do for research with students and professionals and people from the community everywhere, because I think it's something which most people are not very aware of, but I find it quite interesting, and I'm very happy that I stumbled into this field. And just move on to there. So what is it that EEs and that we do? What is electrical engineering? If you're in IEEE, you're probably familiar that electrical engineering includes working with electronics and semiconductors, either developing them or using them. There's production of them. And then we can use those and we can build consumer electronics, both hardware and software. And those consumer electronics include things we use at home, even mundane things like a coffee pot or a microwave are things which electrical engineers get heavily involved with. We use electrical engineering and computer science for robotics, and then biomedical engineering in many different ways. We use electrical engineering for communication systems, your cell phones, the internet that we're using to communicate all the way between Europe and India today. And probably one of the most well-known uses of electrical engineering is with power systems, the electricity that drives a lot of things in our modern world. And then within the field of artificial intelligence, which can be approached both from electrical engineering and computer science, there's a lot of places that artificial intelligence can be applied. To the very famous ChatGPT, which is taking on the world now, to a lot of the same applications which we apply electrical engineering. But if we look at all of these applications that are listed here, and all the things I talked about with electrical engineering, one topic does not show up, which what most people do not associate with our technical fields. We can apply our technical knowledge to the humanities. And quite often, students, when they're studying technology, try to avoid courses in the humanities because they're so interested in their technology classes. And sometimes the humanity courses are not taught in a way that catches their attention and their imagination. But there's really a lot of fascinating stuff going on in the humanities that most people also are not aware of, where we can apply our technical expertise to help the scholars in the humanities extract information that once you get to know it is really quite fascinating. And the further along I get into it, the more fascinated that I am. So what do? My fields of interest and my fields of expertise are in the area called document analysis. And this involves image pre-processing. And image processing is a two-dimensional signal processing problem. So anybody who's taken a signals and systems class, expand that to 2 dimensions, and that's image processing with filtering and Fourier transforms, all those fun things you learn about. And then within document analysis, the most vanilla aspect of document analysis is optical character recognition, trying to recognize the characters in a printed document. And if we expand that to a handwritten document, we call this process HTR, handwritten text recognition. But it's all the same idea, and there's a huge number of different techniques that have been used over the years for OCR and HTR. In order to recognize the actual characters, there's a lot more. We care about the layout. How are those characters displayed on a page? And then what do we do once we have those characters? We form them into words. And how those words are associated with each other can also be modeled mathematically through linguistic modeling. So let's look at optical character recognition. In its basic form, we have a book, and it can be a book, it can be just a page of paper, it can be a scrap of paper, it can be all sorts of different things, but something nominally that has text. And then we consider the basic case where we are going to take a picture of it with a desktop scanner, and that will produce a picture of a page of text. Okay, great. We've been able to capture what's in that physical book in an electronic form, but that picture by itself is not very, very useful. So what we'd really rather do is take that picture and convert it into the text. So we know what letters and words are there, and we can then extract meaning from them. If we go with that text, we can then also add formatting to it. What are the fonts? Is something italicized or in bold? Where are there indentations? Where are there capital letters? Where are there lowercase letters? And within document analysis, we then expand that to say that here, for instance, is the header on a page of book. So it's not the continuation of a story, but it's tell you information about what follows behind. And that there are 2 paragraphs within this text sample. And within that header, it further can be divided to talk about a page number, which allows us to keep sequencing information, more knowledge. And within that text, we can say, well, what's in that text? Well, these are things we call named entities. They're names of people, places, other important things which tell us something specific about the context. Now, OCR is not a new process. Here is a picture from a US patent submitted in 1931 from work done in 1929. That's almost a century ago, before we had digital computers. And you see that there's no computers here. There is electricity going on, and they're shining light bulbs through a little filter and comparing it with a template. So OCR has been done a long time. Now here, they're only using the digits 0 through 9. We can then expand beyond that into the somewhat modern field. Starting in the 80s, we were looking at lots of plain black and white initially, business documents and magazine articles, technical articles, newspaper articles, and then we expanded also into business documents. So we can try and recognize the text in these sorts of documents as well. And the field has moved along quite far over time as technology and knowledge have grown, as people have tried different projects and tried different things. After we got pretty good at doing stuff with machine printed documents, we moved into handwritten documents. And those handwritten documents can take many forms and be of many different scripts. So we've got something in English, something in German, which both use the Latin script. Here's a sample in the Indian script Bangla. Here's something in Chinese. We can also recognize that text. And here's a handwritten document written in a ciphertext, something written in the medieval period in Europe, deliberately trying to hide the information, but still transmit a message. And that's not a script that's used by anybody other than the message sender and the message receiver. And yet we can still use the document analysis techniques to extract what those letters are, and then use computational linguistics to try and unscramble that puzzle to say what was trying to be coded into that text. And some of those ciphers are pretty easy to decipher, and some of them are rather hard and still have not been deciphered by lots of experts with a lot of computing time. Again, every time we try to do a new problem, we expand the technology. And that means we're finding new, interesting problems to solve. And I think that's why all of you went into technology, was to find an interesting problem you could work on. A lot of time is also spent looking at historical documents. Again, we look for difficult things which we can solve because it makes our problems more challenging. And some of these are handwritten, and some of them are printed. And this one in the middle here is printed in some of the earliest machine printed, right after the Gutenberg printing press. And it's still using some old type of printing styles where there's abbreviations and it's written to try and look as if it was written by a handwritten person. And I find these historical documents quite amazing for the information they contain, as well as simply being really pretty to look at. I like the medieval European documents. I think they're very, very pretty. Although I've also gotten into some of the documents that have been created in Asia over time too, and those are quite fascinating. So these put them together form the field which has been branded digital humanities. And this is sometimes a term that's well applied, and sometimes it's not well applied. In its basic form, it's how do we do research and teaching using computing and the fields of the humanities. Now that can have a very large variety of things that are being done in it. And I only have one small component within digital humanities, which is where I focus my time and effort. I'm going to talk to you today about 4 projects I've worked on in the digital humanities. If you come back to me in a year, I've got about 10 more that are coming up in the tracks from my summer that I'm spending in Hamburg, Germany at the Center for the Study of Manuscript Cultures, where the scholars in the humanities are throwing lots of interesting problems at me. But I'm hoping through these 4 projects, you can get a feeling for the types of things which using the technological information and skills can extract from the documents and where they can further the study of the humanities, and the types of questions it allows the people of the humanities to ask. And I asked your student leader what the audience would be, and he said there will be some people in the audience from the humanities, and I'm glad that you joined us today. So the very first project is something called Melville's Marginalia. And I worked together with the professor, Stephen Olson Smith, who's in the American Literature Department at Boise State University, my former university. And this is really his project, not my project. So I'm working with him more than he's working with me. And he's looking to say, how can he study Melville? And maybe some of you have heard of Melville. He's an American author from the mid-1800s, and he's most famous for having written a book about a big white whale. And that's most things that most people who know about him, that's all they know. Most people have not actually read the book, but they've heard about this book, Moby Dick and the Big White Whale. Well, what do we know about Herman Melville? We know that he was born around 1819, and that when he was about 12 years old, his father died. Well, a century ago, if your father died, then the family really was left quite destitute. Because the woman was not expected to work outside the home, and so there was really nothing the family could do. So their family had to change quite a bit. This was before the day of public schooling, so he had to drop out of school because he no longer was able to be supported to further that endeavor. He tried to do some other odd jobs around, study as he could on the side, and finally when he was 19, he says the best thing for him was to go to sea, which a lot of young men did in the middle of the 19th century. Partly this was to earn money, and partly this was to seek adventure. When he was at sea, he had lots of adventures. He went to the Pacific Ocean and ran into a lot of small islands there and met a lot of the locals. And from this, he was able to write his first book, Typee, talking about his adventures, which was greeted by the public in America, in the mid-19th century America, as being quite an interesting novel on quite a bit of an adventure. And because that was so popular, he followed it the next year by another novel. It's good to go where you're getting good work. And then he kept writing more novels on other topics. Those topics varied as to what they were talking about. And finally, his effort came together with his most famous novel, that Moby Dick I told you about, The Big White Whale. Moby Dick was really a literary masterpiece. It was a little bit too above the head of the people who were the audience to read it at the time. The everyday person on the street couldn't understand what he was trying to say in there, and it didn't sell very well. His writing continued. He published several other books, and the last book that he wrote in 1857. At that point, people were not buying his books, so he stopped writing, and he went to work doing other things. By 1876, because people were not buying his books, the publishers were not selling his books. And there was no Amazon or other type of online bookseller to go and get the other books. So his books were out of print. And he became quite forgotten by the people in America at that point. And he finally died in 1891. And nobody really thought anything about him. His books were out of print. He was not a famous novelist at this point. Now, he had a big collection of books and he had all his manuscripts at home. And his wife was saying, well, what do I do with all this stuff that my husband once owned? I don't really want it. So she said, well, let's sell the books and let's throw all of his manuscripts away. She saw no value in them because at that time he was not a famous author anymore. But then several decades later, as the scholars started looking at his book and said, there was really quite a bit of interesting stuff there. They said, okay, let's study him. Who was this Melville guy? What inspired his writing and how did he go about his writing? But they did not have any of his books that he once owned and read, and they did not have his initial manuscripts to see how he went about developing his writing. So how are they going to study his writing when they didn't have very much to go on? Well, some of his books did survive. So family still owns some of them, and they were able to track down some of the books. And in these books, he had a tendency to write notes or to write little scribbles saying that he found these interesting or underline things he thought were of interest. So while we don't have his manuscripts, we do know what he was focusing on, and we've been able to identify many of the books. So we know what topics he was reading about, and we can hypothesize how what he was reading and the things he found interesting in his reading, how this influenced what he actually wrote. So we've done a survey, or people in the literature have done a survey, and they say that when he died, according to the audit of his possessions at death, he owned about 1,000 books, and they've been able to identify that about 500 of them did not wind up in the trash heap totally. They got sold to somebody else or given away. And we also have a list of books that he borrowed from friends or consulted, including some in the New York Public Library. So they've been researching him for about 100 years and making lists of the books that he once owned. Now, initially, these were printed lists, pieces of paper that would be mailed around to people who were of interest. And this got quite tedious, but they became rather studied lists. In 2006, that list was put online, the very early part of digital humanities, by using the internet to use information for the humanities. But just putting a list online is not really using the full power of technology. Then came around this website, melvillesmarginalia.org, that my collaborator, Stephen Olson Smith, developed. And he added to the list images of the pages of the books that we know that he once read. So we got all those pictures with all the scribbles in them. Now people around the world can consult them and do their own analysis. But those are still pictures, just static pictures. They still don't really contain a lot of information. How can we go about doing further study? Well, in this website, we can go through the books one by one. And in there, all of the different marginalia have been annotated manually. So we now know what text is associated with each of the marginalia. And I contributed, the reason I got involved was I was asked to contribute help with the optical character recognition. Remember, I said at the start of this talk, that's where my expertise is. Well, we still want to know, what did he read? We have the list of books. Good. We want to know what he commented to himself. Well, we know where the marginalia is. That's good. But we really still need to figure out, how did that affect his writing? Well, OCR the pages, add the XML. We can look at the frequency of the word marked and the frequency of the words not marked. And then we can work our way into writer style analysis and source text analysis. And those last two are where we're really working a lot of time now. So from the OCR, we get XML, nothing really fancy for somebody in the technology, but it tells us where all those different words on the page are located. And we can annotate them as saying that these were scored, this vertical line here on the left. And then we now have in our XML file information about that. Again, word frequency analysis on the very basic level. We can display that to a user through a word cloud, something which I think all of you have seen before. But we can also do studies of the work. Words alone don't tell you very much. We want to see what words are paired together. So while love is the most common word, what other words are paired with love? And some of those words that are paired together with it, like death, are quite astonishing to see that they come together. And this can lead the humanities scholars to do more thinking. And we can look at those word pairings also visually. We then added to that by looking at how many words are marked by a section in the book. Here's looking at William Shakespeare, some of the different books by him, and which books did he read within William Shakespeare and make more attention to because he marked them up more. Well, apparently he really liked Antony and Cleopatra. So how does this affect his writing? Well, that's usually done by scholars through what's called close reading, where we take a look at a book and we look at the text really carefully. And this is using our human intelligence. So here's one example of a book he read together with a passage from the book Moby Dick, which he wrote. And in there, we've got two sections which include the word gurgling, the bubbling sound that comes out of your mouth, or in this case, out of any other small aperture. Gurgling is not a common English word. So seeing it occur in something he read and in something he's written means there might be more than coincidence there. And if we look where that word gurgled appeared in that text, it's not visible until we use image processing, again, that signal processing that comes out of electrical engineering, that there were some other texts there that he'd marked the passage and he'd written some words to himself, but they'd been erased. But by using image processing, we can extract them and see them. But we can't see all of them because some of them, the erasures are too bad. But we can still use them from a scholarly point. And my colleague has made some hypotheses that what might have been in those gaps, we could rearrange those words and put some guesses in there, throwing in that gurgling word. Rearrange those words a little bit more. Maybe Melville was then building on what he initially scribbled in that book. He makes some other changes as he's working on his writing. And if you make all those changes, we can make that passage of what he wrote for notes match the passage of what he wrote in his major accomplished novel, Moby Dick. Now, we're not sure this is exactly how he went from marginalia into his actual work, but it's a hypothesis that is at least plausible. And if we're studying somebody who's dead, all we can do is say what is plausible unless they tell us otherwise. And Melva's not going to speak to us directly from the dead. Another thing we can look at is what other things did he read and what did he write, and say, was there anything else related there, even if there's not specifically marginalia? So another human expert says these two passages are likely related because it contains the words enthroned, monarch, sovereignty, words talking about royalty. And those types of words also show up in this other passage that he wrote. And then he's talking about the Greenland whale in both passages. So that's probably not coincidence that these two passages contain words that, while they're not perfect matches, have a lot of similarities to them. But if we look at how many books he read and how many books that he wrote, if we're going to do that as a scholar, we've got to compare everything in this first book to everything in this book that he wrote, as well as this book that he read to this book that he wrote, and this book that he wrote, and all these books that he wrote. Now we have to do the same thing for the next book that he read. And I said earlier that we think the books that he read was up in the thousands. This is an awful lot of comparisons for humans to do. Well, what do you do when we're talking about things that humans find too tedious to do? That's when we start using computers and machines. Well, I have one of my postdoctoral students in Luleå, and he has some preliminary works where I asked him, can you do anything? Well, the expert said this great passage I showed you earlier, and my colleague Chang Liu said, well, let's ask a computer, put something together. And he's been able to come up with some hypotheses that the computer is guessing. Maybe he thinks there's this reference here to this passage that's shown in white there, and ask the computer for why those might match, because there's some matches. Or possibly that green text matches this other passage. Or maybe it passes this passage, which matches the one in gray. Now, we're showing many, many possible things, but it's very promising that we're able to get a computer to hypothesize the same thing that the human did. Now it comes down to saying, can we have it hypothesize fewer things and with higher confidence? Because if we throw out too many hypotheses, we're not really reducing the work that the scholars in the humanities need to look at, because we're giving them too many choices that they then need to go back and look at. But I find this really fascinating work that we're able to hypothesize the same thing that a human expert has, and we're hoping that with some further work that we can help scholars further. So this is a sort of analysis we're helping the scholars in the humanities to do. What parts of the text that he read influenced the stuff that Melville wrote, and how? What passage influenced which books? Because we've got all those books read and all those books written. So where do we make those marks together? And in addition to specific passages, which writing styles did Melville emulate as he was learning and developing his own writing style? Because nothing comes and gets developed in a vacuum. Everything that you write is because you were influenced by somebody else, and you then worked and built and developed that beyond there. And we're still working on trying to do some of that in analysis, and we're using technology to help do this. None of the conclusions which we get out of the computer are going to be the final answer, but we're hoping that it can point the scholars in the humanities as to how to focus their attention rather than the thousands of possible pairings that are just random. The second project I want to talk to you about is something on World War I feld posts. This is something I did together with a computer science professor at the Technical University of Dortmund in Germany when I spent my time there, and a historian also in Germany with whom he was collaborating. And that historian was looking at feld postcards sent to the field between soldiers and their families during the World War I period in Germany. And she has a collection of about 6,000 postcards that have been scanned. And the text is handwritten in a mixture of common, what we now consider current Times Roman handwritten cursive text, and an old German script called Kurant that pretty much only people 80 years old and older are able to read today. The young people do not know how to read it. And what the historians are interested in is analysis of the text that was written, analysis of the pictures that are on the postcards. What pictures did the family and the soldiers choose to purchase to write back and forth? And what's the significance in the culture and the history of the things that they've written? And we're just talking little postcards, where sometimes not very much is actually written in those postcards. A lot of the postcard area, as of today, is spent with the address of the person to whom you're writing, and there's not very much room for saying an awful lot. So we get these little tiny snippets, and the way that they're written can vary quite a bit. But they're all pretty short, and they're all pretty hard to read. It's old handwriting on very old and yellowed postcards. And we've got these postage cancellation marks all over the place, too. Well, one of the first things I was asked to do is, can we help to actually look at the text better? Because the people who are 80 years old trying to read this can't read this very well. So I can, again, use the image processing techniques to extract the text and make it just simply more visible. If you can read it more, humans can read it more. Also, it means machines can read it more, and it's easier to extract the information. The next thing I was asked to do was to say, can we locate where those cancellation marks are? At that time in history, most of them were shaped like circles. So we can use a circle detector to identify where there are circles and arcs. And the blues are arcs that were rejected as not being circles, and the reds are circles that were detected as being circles, including this little portion here in the top right, where there's enough of a circle, which we think that it really was a circle. And I think most people would agree that's the case. So from that, we can extract where there are cancellation marks on the page, and we can then extract those cancellation marks. And those are in German are called Stempel. And they have a lot of different conditions, usually quite poor conditions, for many different reasons. But some of them are a little bit better condition, and they have a lot of design variety. And this is what they really want to study if you're a historian, what sorts of shapes the stamps existed and who was using which one. And they contain information about when the postcard was mailed and from where it was mailed. And that can provide a lot of information because you have the address written out of where it was sent to, but not necessarily from where it was sent. In order to extract that, it helps if we can then put those into various groupings together, because when we know what they look like, we then know where to find the information in those stamps, and we can use information from one stamp to find information in another stamp. So I can use and say, these are all similar, and here's a template for what they all look like together. And then the historians can say, okay, in the middle of this bar is where the date's going to be, and location will be information here. And we now can then pull from there the information and help them to read, and again, categorize from there, looking for where there's similarities and extract the information. On that postcard page, we now want to extract all the different things. There's a lot of different categories of information in this little tiny imaging field. There's the stamps and the postmarks. There's horizontal lines, vertical lines, horizontal text, vertical text, and the text can contain different colors. And all those different components contain different pieces of information to help us study these postcards. For instance, finding the vertical line allows us to divide the postcard into two different fields, the address block and the letter writing content block. The horizontal lines allows us to divide the image into the different components of the address, which allows us to know where to extract the information about that address. And when we know where the line is, we can also digitally remove it so that it's then easier to focus on the text and not get mixed up as to what's text and what's line as we're trying to actually read that text. The stamps and postmarks always overlap each other. Well, we can use image processing to remove the cancellation mark from the stamp, and that leads to nice, pretty pictures. But again, the information we really care about is in the postmark, so we can also remove the postmark or remove the stamp from the postmark, and now we can more easily see that this particular stamp was not sent from within Germany to the family, even though it was sent during World War I or right shortly thereafter. It was sent from Jerusalem, and now we have a better information about this, and we can now categorize this postcard. And now the historians can study it a little bit better. Here's another example, just because they're pretty to look at. And you can see how much more information is available when we're able to remove that stamp. It provides information. Information allows people to extract knowledge, and knowledge is power. And that allows our friends in the humanities to go further with their studies. Also, we can take the text and we can separate the text from what's behind it. So we can separate the text from the stamps and the postmarks. And then we can then, with that, start working on focusing on the text and what the text says. The third project I want to talk to you about was one of the projects I worked on when I was in France at the University of Lorraine, with, again, a colleague of mine in computer science and one of his colleagues who is in art in the field of typography. It's a different type of art field where they're trying to develop some of the font styles that you have available to you in any of your word processing packages, whether it's a Microsoft Word product or something like Overleaf, LaTeX. If we look at printing, originally the earliest types of printing involved a manual pressing of ink onto a piece of lead type, and that then would then be put onto paper. And that was done through a piece of lead type. usually individual letters, although prior to individual letters, there was a lot of wood blocks out there. And the typographers were interested in studying this lead type. This lead type then would lead to the books as we're used to seeing them. But a lot of this lead type over time has been melted down because it was no longer considered valuable after new types of printing presses were developed. But the metal itself had value. So those were no longer available, but that's what they want to study. So how can they study without that? Well, those pages of the books which were once printed with it still exist in libraries and archives around the world. And we can use what I call image processing magic to virtually recreate those pieces of lead type. We don't necessarily need the physical three-dimensional block. We really care much more about the digital block. And that's a little bit easier to create than the physical 3D one. And from there, we can extract information about it, and we can create synthetically new type styles that mimic the originally old type styles. This allows us to make new documents that look like they were historical. And when we know those shapes, we can mathematically take these contours, all of these splines with those key points, and do comparisons between different font types. And then this also then allows them to look at some other things as to what was historically going on as they were developing and selling those physical pieces of lead type. So let's take this example from a book printed in 1598. It's something that's available in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. It's a very general scan, not done with any high-tech device, at approximately a 300 dpi, which is your average resolution, which you would scan something at. And the text is pretty dirty text with lots of printing defects as well as imaging defects. We can see through to the other side, and we can see at the bottom of this P, there's this big smudge. Also, we can see that the lead type sometimes left a gap where it did not get inked in this M. So the left bar of the M is separated from the right two pieces of the M. So you might think it's an I and an N. And this A has a little smudge of black in the middle of it from some dirt having gotten in the type during the printing process. So there's a lot of noise going on in what we're trying to look at. Well, there's still enough information there that we can pretty much automatically break it into individual letters. And from that, we can then ask it to say, let's find all the letters of one letter class, such as D. And we can then automatically put those letters together. And when we put those letters together, we can make that letter template that we're looking to do. And that's the work that I've worked on together with this typographer. Now, as we're looking at this, all these individual Ds, we see those Ds have quite a few different forms to them. That the flags down below have different shapes to them. Some of them are short, some of them are long, some of them are horizontal, some of them are a different angle, as well as the serif flags up at the top also have some different shapes to them. So we tend to think that these books that were printed all had exactly the same letters to them, that we had uniform letters even after Gutenberg, when we started unifying the types by using the same mold. But we're finding they really were not as uniform as we thought they were. Well, what do we think happened? We think that the typographer might have initially bought one batch of brand new letters when he started his print shop, but then he got some other replacement ones that did not match exactly, but matched close enough to use whenever they got old and damaged. And that has led the typographers to totally rethink how early printing was done in how the day-to-day business of a type shop went. And as I'm working on trying to develop stuff with the font, there's a lot of other things to consider as we're trying to put it all together. Uniformity of the different serifs, how the different letters are associated with a line, and what is the spacing between them. And I'm still working to put these together and automate this process. But if we were to look at what we could do, here's an example of what we're hoping to do in a few years as we get some of this more automated. We're hoping to take that essay from the late 1500s, do the OCR of it, and this is an old one, so that letter S, if you're familiar with old writing, that letter S had a different form at the time in the Middle Ages. We call a long S. It looks almost like the letter F, as in Frank, without that horizontal bar. We can change that to the modern shaped S, which is that little curvy snake shaped S, which we're used to using in modern print today. And that makes it a lot easier for modern people to read what was written several centuries ago, but printed in an older type of writing style. Now, this is Middle European French. The French language has changed quite a bit since then, and people in France today, young people, also have a very hard time reading that old French, just as you may have a hard time reading some stuff written in India in very, very old predecessor versions of your local language. It's the same thing. It developed from there, but it's changed so much that unless you've studied it, it's quite hard for you to do. So that can be translated into modern French, which now means it's a lot more accessible to both modern day young people in France, as well as modern day people who may have studied may have studied French, but are not living in France. Suddenly we've made this very old document a lot more accessible to a lot more people. And we can also use modern technology and convert that into English, which has become a rather universal language for people. And this again expands how accessible this old document becomes to a larger population of people. This means more people can study it and think about it and make good use about what's in this old novel. Then we can use that type information that I've been able to extract, or we're working to extract, and we can then virtually print this. Now, this is just a prototype. This was not done automatically, but it gives you the feeling that if you did not know better, you would think that this book here, this page, this sample, was written in the 1500s because it looks old, even though this page here was something I created a few years ago manually using some of the information from the type. And this just gives you the feeling of a modern text, which was not written in English, not written in modern English, but you get the feeling that it was an old book, which really it is old text. And that gives you a good feeling about it and maybe helps you put your mind in the right framework as you're reading it and studying it and trying to enjoy it. So it's helping the typographers and other scholars think about the fonts, think how they change over time and space. If I do this over several different books, we can compare mathematically both time and space, how things change, and we can make the text more accessible to other people using technology to further the study and access to the humanities. Now, the next project I want to talk to you about is my newest project, well, newest before I spent the summer here in Germany, called Historia Scholastica. And this is with a history professor at my former university, Boise State. And she also specializes in Latin, the old languages of Europe. And she has this book, Historia Scholastica. Well, our library at the Boise State University has the book. And this is the oldest physical book in the state of Idaho. The United States is a lot younger than India. You guys have a much longer history than the United States does, or at least a lot longer history than the European part of the United States does. There were definitely Native Americans in the United States long before the Europeans came. This book, Historia Scholastica, was originally written in 1170, but then it was such a popular book that it got rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. So if you think of some of your textbooks for your courses, like a circuits textbook, you might be reading and using a circuits textbook that's on its 10th edition. Well, that's the same way that this book went. It got rewritten and rewritten over and over. But that rewriting usually was done manually by scribes' handwriting until the early printing presses occurred. And that 15th century copy owned by Boise State was one of the very, very earliest books ever printed on a printing press. And what she's interested in doing is transcribing the text, because it's very hard to read in its current form. Then she's translating it into English. I'm going to help her determine exactly where it was printed. We've had a couple of experts give their opinions over time, and we're not really sure that either one is right, because the two experts who gave an opinion had contrary definitions of where they think it was printed. That also means we don't know exactly when it was printed either. Once we're able to get the text extracted, we can then compare how does this edition from the late 1400s compare to the editions from the 1100s, and which parts were kept and how did it evolve over time. And our final hope is to create a virtual display so that this really old book, which is very important historically for the state of Idaho, can be shared with a wider audience in Idaho, because most people in the state of Idaho do not know that we own such an old book, because it's locked up in an archive to preserve it. So we can do something to create a virtual display and share it with the people in Idaho. And here's what a page of that text looks like. I showed you that earlier as a sample of one of the historical texts. And these texts, like most old books, have these illuminated capitals, these beautifully decorated stuff. Now, this one does not have any of the gold lettering that the most famous medieval books did, but it still was a nice hand-done illuminated capital in 3 different colors: red, black, or red, blue, and green. And then there are these other capitals, drop caps, which are not nearly as fancy because they're only one color, and they're either red or they're blue. Some other features are the fact that each chapter starts as this little symbol that looks like a C, saying that we got a chapter. So we're not going to identify where the chapter titles are, and those are either red or blue. Capital letters were distinguished by putting a little red mark there, and these red marks were manually added to the book after printing on the early printing presses. So somebody manually took a little brush with a little bit of red ink and painted these little red marks on there. The printing, even though it was done with a printing press, was printed in a way to mimic the way that old handwritten scribal documents would have been made. And this includes touching characters. When the V and the O touch, the E and the S touch, the T and the I touch, and letters that overlap each other. You see this long S again is overlapping vertically with this P. And this T has a back thing to physically overlap space with that C. So we have these touching characters and these ligatures, which makes automatic reading of the text very, very challenging. The other thing that makes it very, very challenging is it contains a lot of symbols that are not in our modern English data set. You are familiar with letters A through Z, both in lowercase and uppercase. But these symbols here are probably ones you're not familiar with. Now, this first one looks like a Q, and it is. And this other one here looks like part of an 8, but it's really an abbreviation for UOD. So this Q with this 8-ish symbol is a symbol for the word quad, which is a Latin word. This P with an extra long bar under it is for the 3 letters PER, as in period. This thing that looks like an S on its side is 2 words, id est. Con, which means whiz, looks like a backwards C, etc., etc. Lots and lots of different symbols that stand for more than one letter. These were developed historically over time because before we had the paper, which was imported out of China, Europe was using parchment, which was made from animal skin, on which to write its books. Well, if you have to use animal skin, it means you have to have animals. And animals are expensive. So in order to write a book, you had to have a lot of money to have the skin, the hide, from a lot of animals. So they would try to shorten things as much as they could in order to fit it all in there. Now here, they're no longer writing on animal skin, they're writing on paper. So they were able to leave the big white space. But the tradition of writing with the scribal abbreviations still existed in the late 1400s. So they're trying to make this modern book, printed with a semi-modern printing press, look like an old book, because that was what people wanted to buy and wanted to read at the time. And now the goal is to try and read that. So some of the technology I'm contributing is color separation. Well, there were lots of different colors if we go through color space. If you scan something in RGB, it's an 8-bit image, so 8 bits per color channel, 24-bit image, millions of different colors. There's really only 4 of interest: the background, the black text, the red, and the blue. 5 if you want to consider the green dots that are in the illuminated capital. So if we can separate the text into those different colors, we have a lot of information about the page. Remember that the capital letters all have little tiny red marks in them. Actually, the annotators missed a few of them, so not all capital letters actually did get their little tiny rubricated red marks. But it can also help us find where are those drop caps, where are the chapter headings, where are the page headings. And this gives us information about the page layout. We can segment the document into the different columns, because when you know where the columns of text are, we know how to read the text and which text is associated with what. Within there, we can break it into the individual lines of text. So now we have the information about the lines, and we now know what to rereading from them. And we can use perspective distortion correction so that everything on that page is a little bit more straight up. My colleague, the history professor, took her pictures of this book with her cell phone camera. So there is some perspective distortion built into there. I'm hoping to get back to Idaho this fall and take a new batch of pictures. But there's still likely to be some page curvature, which we also need to use some image processing to correct. And so we're going to need to do some other distortion correction to have the true pictures of what looks like on the page. And then we can overlay onto it what we're able to extract from it. Now, this is just preparation of the book for that eventual display we want to do. It's also preparation of the book to help the machine tools, which we're going to employ, to make it easier for them to extract and determine what letters are on the page. I've got some preliminary work that I've done to try and extract, or I've not finished doing the work. But here's some preliminary work. We're just detecting a few of the prototype letters, some of the vowels, and the prototype work is able to extract them even when they're touching. Now, some of them are mistakes. This Q was identified as a U, and it's not a U, but it's also color-coded in orange because it's lower certainty that it actually was that case. So we keep working our way through there, and if we can then identify what the different letters are, we put the letters together into words, words together into lines, lines together into paragraphs and pages, and we then have all the text. It then needs to go through that same sequence of steps I showed you with that French book. Plus here we have the scribal abbreviations which need to be decoded, and there's not a one-to-one mapping. And then my colleague can work on trying to translate it. Again, it's written in a very old form of Latin, similar to your old forms of Hindi, and in order to extract and convert that into English requires quite a bit of skill. My colleague has been working on this project for about 10 years, and she's been able to fully transcribe and translate 80 pages. 80 pages in 10 years. Well, if you've got a book of 500 pages, you can see it's going to take her quite a long time. And that's why she was thrilled when she discovered that I was around and hoping that I can help her accelerate this work. And like I said, we're hoping to take this book and be able to eventually put it onto an interactive display, which we can put into the library, where we can show the transcription in Latin. We can then expand it into English with a translation, undo the abbreviations, and provide some historical commentary about what those things that are written in a context which is no longer a modern context. What does the stuff that was written mean relative to humans living in the 21st century? So I hope this gives you a good feeling for some of the interesting things you can do in this field of digital humanities. Several projects, not everything I've done, not everything that anybody else has done, but several different projects which have different goals to them with several different collaborators in several different fields. You can see how we can apply artificial intelligence, machine learning, engineering, computer science to help solve or make progress in problems that are being studied in the humanities. And we can take all these technological fields and the humanities, merge them, and hopefully from that, make a nice, happier world. I also gave a TED talk on this topic. If you want to watch this and see more information about some of these projects, or actually maybe some of them are less information because it's a 17-minute TED talk. And I want to thank you again for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm very happy to take some of the work I did while I was at Boise State. And I thank the people at the Center for Studies of Manuscript Cultures, where I'm spending my summer, give me another perspective about how this work is used in the humanities, and Lulio Technology for bringing me there a few years ago. I'm very happy to be there. And I'm now very eager to take questions from you. And
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your wonderful insights from your projects and experience. It was truly amazing to listen your expertise in the field of humanities. So we are now open to Q&A session. Ma'am, like the people who have registered for the event have already asked the question in the registration form only. So I want to ask the first question was in what ways can young engineers and computer scientists can involve in the digital humanities projects?
well, if you learn about the different technologies you're doing, a lot of it is to find somebody in the humanities who has a question that they can't solve on their own. I would never have done any of these if somebody in the humanities had not reached out with their problem. Students who are at your university can reach out. There's a lot of data sets that are available in some of the open data set platforms where you can just get around and play with things. There's some various old Greek papyri data sets. I'm sure there's a lot of palm leaf manuscripts that are available. Those data sets are available in several open collections. Work on what you can do with those images to extract the text, to make it more visible, to change it around. You can study the different techniques there are for translation of text, for doing parts of speech recognition. Can you find the verbs? Can you find the nouns? What can you do with image processing to make the images look better? There's other stuff you can do with humanities that are not visual image stuff, but are audio stuff. Music is something which is audio, one dimension. Maybe there's something with somebody who's studying music where you can apply your engineering over to music. There's lots of different things. Be creative. Think of what's out there and talk to people in the humanities. It's very good to have a dialogue. You'll be amazed at the things that they're doing. And maybe you don't understand everything the first time, but keep asking, keep talking with them. Partnerships never are something that happens immediately. Partnerships, like I have, are things that are developed over a long period of time, as it takes time to get to know each other, know what your capabilities are, what your interests are, and how you can contribute to everybody.
Can I ask one question?
Please.
Uh, Good afternoon, ma'am. Indeed, it was a wonderful session that you have given. And I'm working in the same institute, Central University of Haryana, as a humanities professor. I teach English. So the
Thank you
example
for
that you
joining.
give, yeah, the example that you've given from Herman Melville, yeah, that is Moby Dick. I mean, you could give an example that going through the text that he had read and he had created, one could find the impact of all those books that he had on him, and that was responsible for his way of writing. But I mean, I have doubts, or I think I really want to pose a question that will digital humanities really help us in understanding only the perception or the way a story or a plot has been developed into a novel. Is digital humanities going to help us that way also?
It can definitely help you. It's not going to replace you. But like I was showing with the example of my history friend who got 80 pages done in 10 years, it can accelerate and give you more information. So, for instance, on that Herman Melville example, one of our former bachelor students from Boise State is now pursuing a PhD in Connecticut, and he's using tools with my OCR output to look at sentiment analysis. And he's looking at storylines throughout the books which were written. He's looking at another author similar to that. And you can say, oh, well, this paragraph is a happy paragraph. This paragraph is a sad paragraph. So how did that storyline in the book that was written, how did that evolve? And do the storylines have that same pattern of happy versus sad over the course of the book? And then that PhD student is then also looking at the annotations that Herman Melville made, the things he commented. Did Herman Melville make a happy annotation or a sad annotation relative to where it was happy or sad in what he was reading along the way? So he's using digital humanities to give him the sentiment analysis and tracking that over the course of the book. And with that, he and his doctoral work is comparing how this is over the different books that have been written and read and over the different annotations. And he's coming up with his hypotheses along the way. So he's using the digital humanities to give him some new technology that he was never available before. And now he's coming up with some hypotheses that nobody else has ever come up with. And both the PhD student and my colleague who's a professor in Boise are thrilled to see these new ways of looking at Herman Melville and these other authors using digital humanity tools.
Fine, ma'am. Thank you.
And that's only just one example of what's being done. Use your creativity for other things. You know, if you never knew the tool was available, you can't come up with a new idea of what to do with it. So find out what tools are out there and then be creative. Every time you get a new tool, it enables you to do something else. And that's where you then come up with your new developments that are important to you from the literature viewpoint.
And now, can these digital humanity can be used into literary theories? For example, the literary theory we have on feminism. We study feminism, and we are now into the third world feminism or the second wave. So, can we, really use this digital humanities in the fields of literary theory as well?
I have a postdoc who's looking a lot of stuff at gender bias in writing. So you could use something that's a bias analysis to take any particular piece of literary text and then go through that text from page 1 to page end and look and say, well, okay, in this particular novel, where is there more gender bias versus where there is not, or where is there more discussion female versus male? And maybe that would give you something that you can use in your gender studies, or you can use that to then compare book 1 and book 2 as you're looking at various bias or gender discussion throughout the course of the novel 1 and novel 2. So maybe that's someplace where you could use it in gender studies with literature. Just a very off-the-cuff guess.
So, in that way, we can plan a tool, and it can be that through AI, the AI tool can be, it will be able to judge whether the given text is gender biased or not.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Or,
Thank you so much.
there's no guarantee that what's come out, but it's as according to one metric, it says that there's bias or is not bias.
You've really cleared my doubts, because I was working on this digital humanities from past 1 year, and I was just looking at how could we bring it into this field, particular field of English literature, because we look for students, we are looking for certain fields where we can work on interdisciplinary areas, and your session was indeed so live. I mean, so, you could break my ice session, you could help me out and come out with this darkness that, yes, I can, if I want, I can work moving into this literary field along. with the electrical engineering field that you're posing for. Thank you so much, ma'am.
And I encourage you to reach out to me separate if you'd like to have a meeting with me and my postdoc who's doing the bias analysis. I'm happy to talk with you at a separate time.
Sure, ma'am, sure.
Okay, so the next question was, what are the biggest challenges you face when applying the technological solution to the problems in humanities, and how do you overcome them?
I think the biggest challenge is first developing the partnerships. You need to understand that the person in the humanities needs to find out that you have some skills that you're able to give. The person in the humanities needs to learn what skills you have in the technology and how they might apply. Similar to how your Professor Aurora was just asking me the question, something she may not have been aware of before, but she has to learn what's available. And then the person in the technology needs to learn to understand what problems are being asked for in the humanities, not to put them down just because they're unfamiliar, but how to understand them and appreciate them and see how we can contribute. And there's a lot of time spent just getting to know each other and understanding, getting common vocabulary. The way in which we in technology talk about a particular topic is not the same way somebody in the humanities does. We sometimes use different vocabulary. And so how to develop that partnership, getting accustomed to working together, finding things you can do, and then actually, there's a lot of time spent before you actually get going on the joint work.
Oh, thank you, ma'am, for answering. Like, if anyone have any other doubts, they may can ask.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I have a doubt that I can want to ask that. As you discussed about your project that we can read the misprint documents as long as are more over. Ma'am, I have several books like that, 2000 or 3000 years old, like you discussed about Manusmriti in your project. But ma'am, I want to ask that how many capability of your project to study the old documents and Indian standard like 2 or 3 years old documents?
I'm sorry, your voice is a little bit garbled. I'm having a hard time understanding you. Can you repeat, or can somebody else repeat again? I'm sorry,
Okay,
it's a
ma'am,
little bit.
ma'am, network issue that is. Ma'am, just I am asking that I have many books like that, 2 or 3 years old. They have the misprints on the page. How we can study the documents with more efficiently by using your project techniques.
We can
Ma'am,
study
like
them with.
yes, ma'am, just like Manusmriti books, which is 3 or 2,000 years old.
Okay, ma'am. I'll ask the question on behalf of him. What he
Thank
is
you.
actually asking. Okay, he's asking. I'm audible to you.
Yes.
Yeah, he's asking. He has a book name is Manusmriti, and some of the pages and some of the line are blurred. He can't read or recognize what is written over there. Okay, so he want to restore that wordings, that paragraph. So how can they restore? So he is actually asking this. I'm summarizing the question. I'm not asking the exactly question of him. Yeah, ma'am.
Okay.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Arjun Kumar. That is my network issue. I cannot even ask your question.
Okay, okay, Arjun. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so some of that depends on what the source of the distortion is, whether the ink or the writing process was actually blurred, or whether it was a distortion during the acquisition when the camera took the picture of the document. So the answers to how you would overcome that depends on what the source of the distortion was. So that needs to be looked at for any specific image that you're looking at, any specific document. If it's just a distortion that comes from the acquisition, there's a lot of image processing tools out there that can remove blur or sharpen an image, similar to what I showed with the World War I postcards where I sharpened the text on there. There's some other tools that are out there where we can just simply recognize blurred text or partially missing text by matching hypotheses to there. There's a lot of old Greek papyri that have missing ink sections or sometimes missing papyri sections, so they can make hypotheses that the letters that are there could either be an A, or it could be a C, or it could be an E, and then the experts can then say which one was the one that might fit in there the best based on other knowledge that the human has about the context. So we can use some of the tools to provide hypotheses. So there's several ways of working with damaged text depending on what the source of the damage is.
Okay, Arjun, I must say you will get your answer. Thank you, ma'am. So
Okay,
Aditya, now
okay.
you proceed.
Like the rest of the questions, can ask directly to ma'am by like reaching her out on LinkedIn or like socials. So now it's time for uh, I would like to hand over to Poonam Sharma ma'am for a thank you speech.
Thank you, Aditya. Um, so now it's time. Uh, Here, as we near the end of this remarkable event, I would like to take a moment to express our sincere gratitude to everyone who has contributed to its success. First and foremost, I would like to extend our heartful thanks to our esteemed guest, Dr. Elijah Burney Smith, for gracing us with our presence and sharing their invaluable insights with us. Your expertise and wisdom have truly enriched our discussions and inspired us all. A, a special words of thanks goes to our organizing team for their tireless efforts in planning and executing this event seamlessly. Your dedication and hard work have ensured that everything runs smoothly, and we are truly grateful for our commitment to excellence. I would also like to extend our thanks to all our attendees for their active participation and insightful contributions throughout the event. Your presence has added immense value to our discussions, and we are grateful for your enthusiasm and engagement. In closing, I would like to express our gratitude to each and every one of you for joining us today. Your presence has made this event a resounding success, and we look forward to your continued support in our future endeavors. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Now I
Thank you
will
again for inviting me to talk with you.
Okay,
now I will like
now, yeah, yeah, Aditya.
yes ma'am. Now I would like to call once again Poonam ma'am for presenting virtual memento to Alisa ma'am.
Yes. Okay, now it's time for memento appreciations. Ma'am, my sincere thanks for your exceptional presentation at the event. Your insights and expertise made a significant impact, and we are grateful for your valuable contribution. Thank you again for sharing your knowledge and making our events a success. Please, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us. And that's all for the today's session. We will be now binding up the session. Thank you, ma'am, once again.
Thank you, ma'am, from our side.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day.
Thank you, ma'am.
Now, everyone can just scan this scanner and fill out the feedback form for receiving certificates. I'm sharing the link in the chat box as well. So thank you all for joining. If you have any question or queries, you can ask to me directly to me. Okay, on my like socials. And this is will be all for the today's session. Thank you all for joining. And now you can leave.
Okay, Aditya, thank you. Thank you for having us.
You will be getting your certificates within 1 or 2 weeks.